Today, the NAFTA system is roughly 1/3 of the global economy, and it is largely self-sufficient in everything you need to make the global economy work. And the United States has the military capacity to reach out and access raw materials that, for whatever reason, are not produced locally. So let's say lithium. You could easily reach out to places like Argentina and Chile. In a world where everything is based on what you have at home, you tend to not be very sophisticated. So we're looking at a systemic breakdown on two fronts. Demographically, there aren't enough people to consume or produce. And geopolitically, the Americans are leaving the party. And the security that has overwritten everything about globalization is now over. Either one of these is a deal killer, and they're both happening at the same time this decade, right now. The challenge in my work has always been to figure out timeframes. Which block do you pull out of the wall, and how does that affect things? But we're now in a position where at least a half a dozen of the blocks have been pulled out. We are feeling that today as the leading edge of a massive inflationary boom in the United States. Now, I said boom. The United States basically has to double the size of its industrial plant in order to make sure that we get the stuff we want. This is a good problem, and it means high growth and high inflation together. Most people are just obsessed about the inflation part right now. They forget that in fixing this, we're going to have some explosive activity. Everything that we're seeing right now in the United States is a problem of strength. And so we can get these weird inflationary and deflationary trends going at the same time. It's going to happen against the backdrop of a currency system that is just becoming singular. We have always thought of the euro as a secondary currency. The idea is that here we've got the world's second largest economic bloc, but the demographic decline there was terminal 2-3 decades ago. And now we're reaching the point where Germany and Italy and a number of others are aging into mass retirement this decade. So it was never going to last. But the Russian sanctions have sped it all up. And that gives the United States a population and an infrastructure ballast that a lot of countries don't have, most notably Russia. Russian oil in Siberia is not like Texas. In Texas, if it gets cold, the Texans lose their mind, but the oil production broadly is fine. If you have to shut in a well, it's not like you can't just turn it back on in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. That's fine. It doesn't work that way in the permafrost. As anyone who's from the north understands, as long as you're moving, you're okay, but if you stop, you freeze to death. Same with oil. And oil is co-produced with a lot of water. So we're looking at 4 to 6 million barrels a day of Russian and probably Kazakh crude going away and never coming back. Now, the United States is the world's largest producer of crude and the world's largest exporter of refined product. We will have some arguments over the details because we're American and that's just how it goes. My projection is that the Biden administration will dust off the authority that Congress gave the administration back in 2015 when we first allowed exports of crude. The Biden administration will shut off those exports. That'll trap a lot of shale crude within the United States and force our refineries to retool to process it. That should bring down the cost of most refined products and give the United States a huge amount of energy security by separating ourselves from now a world in shortage. But that means that the world loses access to Russian and American crude at the same time. Now, if you're a refiner, at first you're going to bitch because your refineries were not designed to run on American crude. They import the heavy sour stuff from like Canada or Venezuela. And now you're going to have to use this light sweet stuff. But on the backside, 2 years later, when the retooling's done, you're going to be able to sell refined product everywhere and at prices that are just ridiculous. So they'll be the biggest to complain and then the biggest to benefit. For oil, I think we're okay. Let me jump though to the one where we probably are going to have some challenges to make. If you talk about non-food, non-energy commodities, Russia is the world's largest producer writ large, and it falls into a lot of different categories. But the United States does not have a normal steel industry, for example. We are the world's greatest steel recyclers. We use arc furnaces to just take the old steel, turn it into new steel. But if you want something that's pretty, arc furnaces are great if you're making like I-beams and car frames, but if you want to make like appliance cladding or roofing materials, it's kind of ugly. You need fresh steel for that. So what we do is rather than take the iron ore and put it into a blast furnace, then go through multiple rounds of refining to get the final product, we skip that first half. We buy semi-finished products, iron, pig iron, from other countries, and we took that through our high-end process, and we get the highest quality steel in the world with it. But 2/3 of that semi-finished iron comes from Ukraine and Russia. So if we want to avoid some issues with, steel, we need to build a few foundries very quickly. Right. That hasn't started yet. And if you want one to really worry about, neon's a fun one. So we use neon to run the lasers that etch semiconductors. Well, 70% of the world's neon comes from the former Soviet Union, and it's a 2-step process. Step 1 is air separation units at those steel foundries that we don't have. And the step 2 process to get the commercial grade neon, the purified stuff, that's done in Ukraine. So not only is the Russian steel offline because of sanctions and boycotts, but that second step, the important step, is all done in Ukraine, and half of that was done in Mariupol, and that facility is now gone. We get to decide in the not too distant future what we don't really need semiconductors for. If we want to rebuild that supply chain, step 1, build the foundry. Step 2, put air separation units in it. Step 3, build that secondary phase. There's no way you do that in less than 3 years. I would love for the government to take an active role in that. I'm not convinced it's going to happen. And this isn't necessarily a criticism of the Biden administration, although if you interpret it that way, you might be wrong. But we haven't had to have a national economic policy in this country since World War II. We're not good at that sort of planning. We let the market do its thing. And in a globalized world, we've moved up the value-added chain, and a lot of those lower quality steps we have allowed other countries to do because they can do it more cheaply, until the supply chain system breaks down. And now, out of a sense of necessity, it's got to come back. Now, in that, we have some advantages over all the other developed countries of the world. Courtesy of the shale revolution and the fact we have so much elbow room, the development costs for what are normally low value-added products here are already the cheapest on the planet. Shale revolution has kept our electricity and our plastics and our natural gas prices low. Our petrochemicals costs are the lowest in the world. So we can do the high value-added stuff on the back end with our high-end labor and our instrumentation, but we can also do the stuff that normally elsewhere in the world is done by low value-added economies, the heavy industry stuff. It's the part in the middle where it gets a little bit messy. Enter Mexico. Mexico is highly efficient in terms of output per worker hours. They're just going like this now for 20 years. And they're more competitive than really any of the other mid-developed countries out there. And by some measures, they're already ahead of the Canadians. So it's the perfect partner. We still have to build out all the industrial plant. And there will be hiccups. Semiconductors is one where I'm a little worried. Assuming we solve the neon problem, I think the Biden administration is on the wrong track with semiconductors, because we do the high-end stuff. We do the stuff that's in your cell phone or that's in a server farm. So one of the fun things about fabs is it's all done under one roof because it's all clean room work, so it has to be. We only produce about 12% by volume, but we produce about 60% by value. So if it's a chip you're going to use in a spaceship or a high-end cell phone or a server farm, it's probably made in the United States already. The high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is chasing, these are things that are produced in places like Japan and Taiwan and Korea, allies. I'm not saying I'm disappointed that it might be coming back, but I'm like, that's not where the weakness is. The problems are further down the quality scale. If you're talking Internet of Things, that's probably China. If you're talking automotive, that's probably Malaysia. That's where the holes are going to be in the future. So a degree of integration is still going to be required if we want all those things to continue. Or we're going to have to find a way to allow American fabs to go down market. And that's not something you normally do unless the government is directly involved. Some of the companies, based on what the manufacturing subsector happened to be, started these moves 5 years ago. Others, like Apple, refused to admit there was a problem until May. And so they're only now starting to get their arms around the size of the problem. And 94% of their supply chain is within mainland China, so yikes. One of the reasons that we don't trust the government to do this is the government has not a particularly good track record. And that's not a criticism of our government, that's of all governments.
Any government,
yeah. When the government is going to start picking winners and losers, there's a cost to that. And that assumes that they get it right every single time. We're kind of in this transition period now where we would like the government to be more productive. It's unclear if they can. And where the corporate world has risen to the threat, but several years too late. And it's happening just as the baby boomers move into mass retirement, so we're doing it in an environment of a financial and a worker shortage. Well, as a Gen Xer, the boomers going away is not doomsday, but that's just me. Every inflationary trend of the post-war period is now coming back, and every disinflationary trend is turning on its head. So when we had our first big industrialization push in the 50s and 60s, it was all industrial driven. We now have to do that again with the manufacturing build out. We have to double the size of the plant within 5 years. And then in the 60s to the 80s, we had the baby boomers come of age and buy houses and raise kids and all that consumer-driven inflation. Well, we've got the millennials going through the same process now. So we have to go through that process again. In the 80s and 90s, the Chinese joined the global economy, and so 1 billion workers pushed down the cost of manufactured goods. That's going away because the Chinese population is the fastest aging in history. And we also had an empire worth of Russian materials dumped on international markets in the 90s, keeping commodity prices under control for 30 years. And that's all now going away. So all 4 of these are happening at the same time. So 9 to 15% inflation for the next 5 years, I think is a good kind of starting point for the conversation. That assumes that we actually put our back into rebuilding and building out the industrial plant. If we fail to do that, we get almost as high of inflation, but 5 years from now, we haven't fixed the problem, and that just continues. For the last 25 years, Texas has been the American state that has grown the most robustly because, I don't want to say they've been anticipating this, but because a lot of the natural advantages of the United States, cheap land, cheap food, cheap electricity, exist there in spades, and they've got the partnership with Mexico just across the border. The Texas-Mexico axis has been globally competitive at the height of globalization in almost every sector. We now have the opportunity for the other 49 to join the party. And that's great. But every state is going to have their own policy. Every municipality is going to have their own policy, and not everyone's going to get it right. We're going to see both the strengths and the weaknesses of the federalized system now. Because the ones that get it right, hopefully the others can learn from it. But we're not all going to get it right on the first try. And places like South Carolina and Alabama and obviously Texas look really solid. But places like Florida and California are just kind of out in their own world right now. Manufactured products, the more complex they are, the more parts they have, the more varied a labor structure they require. So, for example, if you want to make a fax machine, the optic scanner is made by one group of workers. The plastic casing, which is injection molding, is made by a less skilled group. And then the wiring is done by somebody in the middle. 3 different groups, minimum. The more diversified the system, the more important it is to have a partner in the wage structure, both in terms of quality of labor and cost of labor. And that's one of the reasons why the Texas-Mexico tango works so well. Texas has your high-tech workers in Austin, has your mass manufacturing in San Antonio, has your financial center in Dallas, and has your heavy industry and medium industry in Houston. So that is already 4 just in Texas. You go south of the border and you've got a similar makeup with all of the Mexican cities. And so the back and forth works great. This is one of the reasons why automotive does swell in this zone. Automotive obviously is going to expand. Heavy machinery, heavy vehicles like ag equipment, construction equipment, that is going to kind of be a tag-along. But I'd really look very closely at electronics. Whether you're talking, not cell phones, but pretty much everything else that is not a computer and not a cell phone that runs on electricity that you use in your house, whether it's a blender or a smartwatch or whatever else, that is really well positioned. It will also employ 3 to 4 times as many people as automotive. And it all needs to come back, because right now almost that entire subsector is done in East Asia and it's China-centric. And that's not sustainable anymore. This is not something that has to be just Texas, but Mexico's got to be a part of the process no matter what. All of the border states can play. There's more than enough for everybody. But the one downside, labor. We're pretty close to tapped right now, and the Mexicans are not too far behind. So there's definitely a first come, first serve sort of environment in play here. Well, there's 2 big issues here. And remember, the hard legal work has already been done for all of this. NAFTA 2 has been ratified and implemented by all sides. The U.S. already has a free trade deal with Colombia. So these are good things. The labor crunch in the U.S. and Mexico is becoming so acute that labor costs in Mexico have been rising. In part, this is because the Mexicans have moved up the value-added scale very impressively, but there's just a numbers issue. So Mexico is now in a position where it needs a lower wage, lower skill base. Mexico needs a Mexico. And Colombia is the most likely candidate. Second, like Mexico of 20, 30 years ago, Colombia is also a significant producer of a lot of the raw material inputs. So for first stage processing or lower value-added manufacturing, it was already a solid choice. And so we're going to be seeing North American NAFTA integration with the Colombian manufacturing space in a way that I think is going to be really impressive. There are obstacles along the way, there always are. They could use a lot of infrastructure improvement, for example. But I'm pretty bullish and pretty positive on the nature of that integration moving forward. Yeah, Americans luckily have diversified their taste when it comes to what integration means. It used to be that if you lived in Kentucky, your idea of export was going to Indianapolis. That's in the past now. Most American business people are pretty savvy, and while not everyone can merge with the Mexican system as effortlessly as the Texans can, there's a degree of understanding in the American space that this is necessary, and it's not going to just magically happen. We have to work at it. When you start breaking down the system, you get smaller pieces with less reach and fewer materials and less manufacturing in a smaller market, but that's not true for everyone. So I can see a world where the United States, after some admittedly hiccups, a few years from now, is now looking at shorter, simpler supply chains that are closer to home in what has become basically a captive market with the world's largest consumption base. That's pretty good. Parts of the world that can either do kind of a mini version of this, thinking here Argentina or France, or there are parts of the world who have basically approached the US from a political point of view and a security point of view and says, yeah, okay, you're not going to support globalization anymore unless we pay you. Got it. What was that number again?